Alright, so move on to the next segment. I'll be sharing my UFC 303 co-main event prediction between Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes. So this will be the new co-main event of UFC 303. Both fighters, shout out to both featherweights, Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes, for stepping up on a 2 weeks notice, just like the fighters that will be in the main event of UFC 303, what Alex Pereira and Yuri Prochazka are doing, stepping up and saving UFC 303, because after we needed a new co-main event after light heavyweight fighter Jamal Hill, who was supposed to be on the UFC 303 co-main event, making his return after his defeating loss to Alex Pereira in the main event of UFC 300, pull out of the co-main event due to an injury. So shout out to both featherweight fighters, Brian Ortega and Diego Lopes, stepping up to the plate and helping save UFC 303 as well. So these are my following storylines heading into this fight. Is Brian Ortega the same fighter? And what I mean by that is, does Brian Ortega still got it? Is he still the same elite fighter from the past? Last time we seen Brian Ortega in a big fight was against Alexander Volkanovski, fighting for the featherweight championship in 2021. And he lost that fight by decision. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no shame in that, because Alexander Volkanovski is going to go down as one of, if not the greatest featherweight champion of all time, behind Jose Aldo right now in the UFC history books. But then when you look at what Brian Ortega did in 2022, his only fight in 2022, he lost to Yair Rodriguez in 2022, but then defeated him in his return to 2024 after taking a year off from the octagon, defeating Yair Rodriguez by submission. But I still need answers to see if Brian Ortega is still that elite guy in the featherweight division. Is he still that elite fighter? Well, a lot of questions are going to be answered in the co-main event of UFC 303. My last storyline is Diego Lopes ready for the big moment? Is he a true contender in the featherweight division? We're going to find out, because I do believe that Diego Lopes, his stock is currently rising in the UFC, especially in this featherweight division. And I think he's a young contender. I mean, obviously right now we see him climbing the rankings, and he's official ranked contender right now in the featherweight division. I'll get to that in a few moments. But he had an impressive victory at UFC 303 on the premium card against Sadiq Youssef, winning that fight by KO on the UFC 303 premiums, which really put him in position to get a big-time fight against a future contender in the featherweight division. Now he gets his big break and his big test in the co-main event of UFC 303. We're going to see what Diego Lopes is all about this weekend in the UFC. But this is my tale of the tape for the fight. You have Brian Ortega, who has 16 wins, 3 losses in his MMA career. He has 3 victories come away of knockout, 8 victories come away of submission. He is currently the number 3 ranked featherweight contender in the UFC today. Currently stands at 5'8" and has a reach advantage of 69 inches. Then you look at Diego Lopes, who has 24 victories, 6 losses in his MMA career. He has a total of 10 victories come away of knockout, 12 submission victories. Currently the 14th ranked contender in the featherweight division, currently stands at 5'11" and has a reach advantage of 72 inches. So the height and the reach advantage goes to the underdog Diego Lopes heading into this co-main event at UFC 303. Now, these are the following game plans that I do believe that these fighters should follow if they want to walk out possibly in line for a featherweight championship fight down the line. Starting off with Diego Lopes. I do believe that Diego Lopes is going to have to use his striking abilities in this fight. And I feel like it's his bread and butter right now. I mean, I know I said that Diego Lopes has 12 victories come away of submission. But I just feel like right now the best thing of Diego Lopes' arsenal is his striking ability. Because he won his last 3 fights by knockout in the first rounds of his last 3 fights. So if he gets in the striking department, I think he has a good chance of winning this fight against Brian Ortega. Last but not least, I think that Diego Lopes is going to have a fighter's mentality of you have everything to gain and nothing to lose. Because Diego Lopes is getting a huge opportunity here. You're coming on a 2 weeks notice, helping save the UFC 303 card, and you're fighting an elite fighter in Brian Ortega. This is your big break. So I feel like he has to throw everything in the kitchen sink at Brian Ortega if he wants to be successful and get his name in the conversation, possibly for a future featherweight championship fight, depending on maybe against Ilya Tupara or Max Holloway or whoever has the featherweight championship very soon down the line in the UFC. A victory here to speak volumes and levels for Diego Lopes moving forward if he could win and continue to climb up the rankings in the featherweight division. Now, let's go with the guy, Brian Ortega, the elite fighter, hopefully. But Brian Ortega, I think he's going to have to use his MMA IQ in this fight and his experience. Brian Ortega has shared the octagon with some great featherweight fighters. Arguably in the conversation for greatest featherweight fighters of all time thus far in the UFC history books. He shared the octagon with Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway. And even though he's lost to Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway, you gain experience and wisdom fighting these type of elite guys in the octagon. And I think he's going to have to use that experience against Diego Lopes, who has never fought a ranked featherweight contender in his UFC career thus far. So I think he's going to have to use his MMA IQ and his experience in this fight against Diego Lopes. Last but not least, I think Brian Ortega can win in a grappling battle against Diego Lopes. Now, we're playing with fire here. That's why I think this is an intriguing co-main event for UFC 303. Because Diego Lopes is good as a striker and a grappler. I mean, Brian Ortega really isn't known for his striking, but grappling, if you're into grappling and wrestling and MMA fights, this could be what you like. Because this fight could easily be on the ground for a long period of time. But if it goes to a grappling battle, I have to back Brian Ortega in this situation. And I think this could be his best way of winning the fight, having ground control on the octagon, on the mats. And Brian Ortega is a tremendous grappler. I mean, 8 submission victories in his MMA career. And the man is very crafty on the mats. I mean, I can't even, sometimes I can't even describe what the man is capable on the mats in terms of the grappling department. So if it goes to the grappling department, I think it's Brian Ortega's best chance of winning the fight. But with that being said, this is tough. This one was tough. But I'm gonna go with Brian Ortega to win this fight by decision, defeating Diego Lopes in the co-main event at UFC 303. I really believe that this fight could go either way. And I would not be surprised if Diego Lopes gets his hand raised, but I have to back Brian Ortega in the co-main event at UFC 303. And I'm leaning towards Brian Ortega for 2 reasons in the co-main event. One is his grappling abilities. Like I just touched upon, he has 8 victories come away of submission. The man is a great grappler and a great wrestler. And if it comes to a MMA, if it comes to a grappling affair or a wrestling affair, I think I have to back Brian Ortega because I do believe he could get a lot of seconds and possibly minutes in terms of the grappling control, ground control for this fight. Second, I have to lean towards Brian Ortega for his experience. Brian Ortega has shared the octagon with some great featherweights, some of the greatest featherweights of all time, Alexander Volkanovski and Max Holloway. Like I just touched up on, even though he lost those fights, you gain a lot of wisdom fighting those elite fighters. And I think experience is going to go a long way. I think he's going to use an MMA IQ in this fight because Diego Lopes doesn't have the big-time experience yet. He has yet to fight a featherweight contender, a ranked featherweight contender, and he's fighting an elite guy in Brian Ortega. And I think Brian Ortega is going to use the grappling abilities and his MMA IQ and experience to defeat Diego Lopes in the main event of UFC 303. But that is my co-main event prediction between Diego Lopes and Brian Ortega, Diego Lopes in the co-main event of UFC 303.